Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's just terrific to be able to talk to a live audience. I don't think that's happened in this context now with me for a couple of years, and it's just terrific. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Piggott, and I have the privilege of directing the ARC Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research, CEPAR, and CEPAR is co-hosting this event today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and to pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present, and emerging, and to extend that respect to any Indigenous people who are with us today. It's terrific to welcome such a distinguished group to the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, both those who are here today, and it's a very respectable live audience today for those of you who are online, but we're running this in hybrid form, and there's also an online presence. We have nearly 100 people all up, if we count both the ones before me now and those online. For those online, it will be necessary for you to click a new web link for each session. So this technology has gone a little beyond me, and I can't explain further than that, but I've been asked to say that. I guess you'll email someone if it makes no sense to you. The policy dialogue is one of a series. We've tried to run one of these each year for the past several years. And last year we failed because of COVID. So this policy dialogue actually is 12 months late. We do this, CEPAR does it jointly with CAMA, and CAMA is run by Warwick McKibbin, who is here with us today and is a CEPAR CI. And so it's very much a joint deal between the two research organizations. I don't want to take a lot of time up because we have a very packed agenda. What we're trying to do with these policy dialogues is literally establish a dialogue, and we deliberately hold them in Canberra because most of what we have to say is, on the whole, more relevant to policymakers than to business. We do run business forums in Sydney, but for this particular kind of meeting, we think Canberra is the more appropriate location. And so we place the dialogues here deliberately to encourage interaction with policymakers. What we have also tried to do in recent times is to link the policy dialogue with what we call research briefs. And these research briefs are syntheses of the literature, more than the literature, a synthesis of the state of knowledge of where we are on a particular issue. And we cite the CEPAR research, we put that into blocks within the research brief, and then also fill in the gaps with statistical analysis so that a coherent narrative emerges. And the person primarily responsible for this is Rafal Chomik, and Rafal is here today and will be talking to you later. But this actually arrived yesterday, right? So this is this year's, and you'll have one on your seats, this year's research brief, and it's a terrific document. I think it really updates employment policy issues and issues around mature workers for Australia in a way that perhaps hasn't been done for a number of years. I think that's all I want to say by way of introduction. It's now my great pleasure to introduce, very briefly, Professor Sharon Bell. So Professor Sharon Bell is the Interim Dean of the College of Arts, Asia and the Pacific at the ANU, and her previous role was Deputy Vice Chancellor for Strategy and Planning at Western Sydney University in Sydney, where she's an emeritus professor. She's also an emeritus professor at the University of Wollongong, right? And in January 2019, she was appointed a member of the Order of Australia. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the podium over to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Piggott. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting here in Canberra, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and acknowledge elders past and present. It's so important to us to remember that we're drawing on the deep knowledge of our Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and the relationship with those peoples is so critically important to us. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to the CEPAR dialogue at the Australian National University, and I'd particularly like to welcome all those who are joining us online. It's always, as Professor Piggott indicated, a great pleasure now for us to be meeting face to face, but also we're very mindful of just how rich our dialogues have been and what an extensive audience we've been able to reach over the past year and a half through the circumstances with which we've been dealing. So welcome those online. The broad aim of the policy dialogue is to provide a frame in which the debate can take place from academic, policy and industry perspectives. It's really important in terms of population ageing and in this year to consider the current and future challenges of the ageing workforce. When Professor McKibbin asked me to do this introduction, my immediate response to him was, I'm delighted to do so because I'm a living example of the ageing workforce, having celebrated, or rather not celebrated, my 70th birthday last year in the middle of COVID lockdown, and indeed having attempted to retire unsuccessfully twice in my career. So I'm very aware, and I like to think that, being an example of being able to make a very small but productive and continuing contribution to organisations is critically important. We're looking at a very significant emergence of a demographic pattern at the moment. The share of workers aged 55 plus has more than doubled from 9% in 1991 to 19% in 2021, led by women re-entering work in midlife and delaying retirement. And of course, that is something where there is a rapidly changing dynamic in terms of the COVID and post-COVID environment, although we know we can't yet talk of post-COVID. By 2050, those aged 55 and over are expected to make up about 40% of the adult population in Australia. The topic of this year's policy dialogue is mature workers in organisations to consider emerging policy issues for a productive future. One of the things I'd like to say, and I hope the organisers don't mind, is I hope we add a footnote to each element of this dialogue, that it's important to understand workers in organisations, but COVID has actually, I like to think as COVID as a crack, a societal crack, which has actually let the light in, and particularly in our understanding of the workforce and the fragility of many aspects of our workforce. COVID has actually exposed much which we didn't understand, or in fact was rather invisible to us. The precarious workforce, which has become so significant in Australia, was something that has been really not in the sights in the way it should have been, and we're learning the consequences of that in so many critical sectors, in our service sectors, in health, in education, in our extractive industries, in our agricultural industries. We are dealing with fragility that we, in one way, did not know existed. So I hope that while your emphasis is in organisations, that you're always thinking, and what is actually happening outside the organisational context that we need to take into account. In that context, I'm mindful of the work of the late Graham Hugo on the higher education sector. And for several years, he produced influential work on the profile and demographics of the higher education workforce, which influenced government policy, importantly. Most of that work did not, in fact, include the casual workforce in higher education. The casual workforce in higher education now numbers at least 95,000 people, according to the Grattan Institute, the last Grattan Institute analysis. That is a workforce that we in universities know very, very little about. And I don't think we're the only industry that actually faces that that tension. We can't say in universities in the higher education sector at the moment what has been the impact on that casualised population, that precarious sector of employment in our industry. So I'm sure that would be repeated across many industries. And it's so important for us to understand because, as I said, it's an aspect of significant fragility. But that's my particular preoccupation and my lens. Some of the topics that you're looking at for today include workforce demographics, shifts in mature workforce participation and employment, policy context for a changing world, including the regulatory context in Australia and innovations at the workplace level, international lessons and experiences, healthy and high-performing mature workforce, inclusion, individualisation and integration strategies in Australian workplaces, COVID-19 and mature workers, and how do we make longer working lives feasible. Of course, identifying opportunities and challenges for policy development and implementation. So I think it's going to be a rich day, critically important day in terms of policy development and informing policy development. And I'm pleased to be able to join you here today to learn. I hope I will learn a great deal from you, and I hope you all have the opportunity to learn from one another. I'd now like to introduce you to the chairperson of the first session, a man who needs no real introduction, Professor Warwick McKibbin. Warwick is one of my most respected colleagues, I'm going to say, and someone who I admire greatly, even though, because of COVID, we've only recently met face-to-face. We've had a number of exchanges on email, and I've come to know a great deal about his work. Warwick is Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Centre of Applied Macroeconomic Analysis, CAMA, in the Crawford School of Public Policy, where those of us who are meeting face-to-face are meeting today. He is also Director of the Policy Engagement, a Chief Investigator and ANU Node Leader of the AR Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research. He's an ANU Public Policy Fellow, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, a Distinguished Public Policy Fellow of the Economic Society of Australia, a Distinguished Fellow of the Asian and Pacific Policy Society, a non-resident Senior Fellow of the Brookings Institute in Washington, DC, and President of McKibbin Software Group, Inc. You don't need to say any more except that Warwick obviously never sleeps. The one thing that I'd like to add to the formalities of this introduction is that he's been engaged with the Lowy Institute, so in the think tank environment. He's deeply involved with government. He spent a decade on the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia, and has also served as a member of the Australian Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council and on the Australian Prime Minister's Task Force on Uranium Mining, Processing and Nuclear Energy in Australia. So Warwick has very deep links into government. And one of the things that is wonderful about Warwick is that he absolutely shares those links. He's a wonderful mentor of the next generation, and his inclusion of students and early career researchers in his work is something that we value highly. So I'd like to ask Professor McKibbin to come to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon, for that very warm introduction. I'm somewhat embarrassed, but I don't normally get put off what I was about to say, but that was a very generous introduction. This meeting has been a very long time in coming. As John said, we've been planning this for some time, and it's wonderful to see so many people in the room, and I'm sure there's as many people online. This session specifically is about a macro perspective on mature workers in the workforce and emerging policy issues. I should mention, John already has, but this report, which came out today, is a wonderful overview of the key issues, and the first section is actually on the topic of this session on macro aspects. We have three excellent presenters today. We have Rafal Chomik, co-author of this report. I should also mention that Fatima Jamal Khan is also in the audience. She's a co-author of this report. We also have Marian Baird and Mark Cully. Now, the bios of the three presenters are in the overview document. I'll say a few things because it's important to let you know who these people are because they're the leaders in this field. Raf will go first. He's economist at CEPAR. He's been at CEPAR probably since the beginning, at least since 2012. He works on social policy, demography, modelling of demographic, economic and financial issues, policy-orientated research translation, of which he is a star, and data visualisation. He has a long history working in government and in the private sector on social policy issues. The second speaker is Marian Baird, AO. Marian is one of Australia's leading researchers in the field of women, work and care. She's a chief investigator in a number of grants, but particularly on the CEPAR Centre. She became Professor of Gender and Employment Relations in 2009, distinguishing her as the first woman to be appointed as a Professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Sydney. She's presiding Pro-Chancellor at the University of Sydney and head of the Discipline of Work and Organisational Studies and co-director of the Women, Work and Leadership Research Group at Sydney Business School. Marian's CV is very extensive. She's got many awards, but there's some I just wanted to highlight. She was awarded an Officer of the Order of Australia for outstanding services to improving the quality of women's working lives and for contributions to tertiary education in 2016. In 2018 and in 2019, she was named Apolitical's list of 100 most influential people in gender inequality in the world. So that's a very impressive background. And finally, I'd like to welcome Mark Cully. Mark, I've known for many years. He's head of the macroeconomic analysis and policy division in the Australian Treasury. Before joining Treasury, he was appointed as the inaugural head of the government's deregulation task force. He's been chief economist at the industry department. He made significant contributions in that role, which I know firsthand. And before that, he was chief economist at the immigration department. He's an authority on labour markets, innovation and business performance, and the use of data insights to underpin effective policy making. So those three speakers, the format of this session will be each speaker will present 15 to 20 minutes. Each speaker can come to present and please return to your seat. And then when we've completed the presentations, I'll invite the speakers to come and join the panel. It's a bit more complicated Q&A session because we have people in the audience and we have people online. The way we'll do this is if you have a question in the audience, please ask the question. The microphones can't be circulated because of COVID restrictions. So ask the question. I'll repeat the question to the online audience. The panel will hear your question and then hear my reinterpretation of your question, and you can answer either. And then if you're in the audience online, please, you can either click on the participants link. You have an email you would have received. You can click on that, and if you open the Slido website and input the code for this session, you'll be allowed to ask a question. You can also go to the CEPAR website, event website, and ask questions there. So let me not take any more time, and let me please invite Raf for his presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Warwick, for the introduction. As has been mentioned, we're launching this research brief today on the topic. The brief was co-authored with Fatima, as Warwick has mentioned. So thank you very much, Fatima, for all her work on this. It features the insights from over 30 researchers. Some of them I also want to thank for their input. So to Daniela, Marian, Mark, Sharon, and John, thank you very much. And so it's my job to give you a bit of a highlight of the research brief and also set some of the macro context today. And I'll do that in three parts. So I'll talk about the macro demographic context, which a lot of you will be familiar with some of this, but it's always helpful to start on the same page with the latest numbers. I'll talk about health, education and social trends, and these are pointing in the positive direction, but also expose some of the barriers faced by older workers. And I'll also talk about an assessment of age friendliness of the labour market that goes beyond just the labour force participation rates. So our point of departure is the expected number of older people in the population. Here I use 55 as the cutoff, and showing proportion of 55-plus-year-olds within the adult population. So on current projections from the ABS, the latest official projections from the ABS, median variant, we're looking at 34% going to 37%, and it's gone from 25% in 1980. But those paying attention to demographic projections will know that these are subject to uncertainty, as we've seen with some of the IGRs, and perhaps we'll see later this month what the projections show. So already, if you look at fertility decline since 2018, that proportion increases. And of course, we've had the pandemic with migration that's been down. That would be, with a longer pandemic, is expected to push that to 40%. Actually, more pessimistic projections, assumptions about fertility and lower migration assumptions by the UN before the pandemic saw that higher again. And so this is just a reminder about how the assumptions do affect the projections and that they are uncertain, but also that things like migration affect Australia's demography quite a lot. So as just an illustrative exercise, if we had no migration at all, this is what that line would look like. So essentially we're looking at something like Germany without the Australian migration. So this is just a little bit more detail about the projection itself. So this is based on work of CEPAR's Tom Wilson and Jeremy Temple and a colleague in Queensland. The shorter scenario is a fertility drop of 1 to 1.65 children per woman, which bounces back quickly and postponed births are recouped. Negative migration is 0 and returns to 210,000 by 2023. The other extreme is the longer scenario, which is a deep global recession for longer, fertility dropping to 1.45, and takes years to recover, with migration not recovering until 2029. So that's the more extreme. In between is the moderate scenario. So by 2050, the different scenarios could see Australia's projected population to be about 600,000 to 2.3 million smaller than the no pandemic scenario. So a greater potential supply of labour from older people is, of course, not enough. You need them to actually supply that labour, and then you need firms and businesses to demand that labour. So I'm going to keep emphasising those two sides of the coin. And you'll see that as I talk about the participation rate changes over time. So that's men from young to older, and women there. So in grey is the OECD countries, and black line is OECD average, just for context. As you can see, younger men's declines, increases for younger women, and the column you want to focus on is really the third column. The past few decades of favourable economic growth have seen a surge in mature participation rates, and you can see that particularly for women. And this is really the lesson that I know CEPA's Peter McDonald has been talking about for some time, is that labour force participation historically has been driven by greater labour demand that saw people both re-enter work in midlife and decades later appear in those mature age labour force participation rates. You can see that in just a little bit more detail here, which shows you the growth rate in participation rate with a 5-year average. Notice particularly for women, that rise at older ages appeared decades earlier. Notice also the more recent slowing in that growth. Again, the lessons are that labour demand is important, that pathways to recruit and retain workers from mid-career are important, and that at older ages, retention is easier than activation, although the way that active labour market policy activates people that aren't receiving welfare is also perhaps an issue. So what's possible in the future? I expect Mark will talk a little bit more about these projections, but Treasury has done some projections for labour force participation by age. Shown here, on current trends, there is little change for men and some increases for women. And part of that discussion today is whether we should be aiming for greater levels of participation, whether we should be more ambitious. For example, over the ditch in New Zealand has much higher rates for men, and already rates that are projected for Australia for 2050. That's probably driven by a lack of the means text within the age pension that they have. But Sweden, which has a very strong means test, also has higher participation rates, especially for women. So I would argue that it's both retirement income system and some of the supportive policies in place that are there. What does that mean for labour supply? So in the brief, we enumerate some of the impacts of different scenarios by combining population and participation projections. So without any aging, but increases in participation rates, you would see labour supply per capita increasing, continue to increase. With aging but no participation changes, you'd see a precipitous decline. We're somewhere in the middle, and with a longer pandemic, as you've seen, more aging means a lower level of per capita labour supply. If, just for illustration, we had New Zealand's participation rates, this is what it would look like. It would essentially moderate back to the same level. That projection also allows us to look forward at the composition of the potential workforce. In 1990, as we've heard from Professor Bell, it was 9%. 55 plus has made up 9% of the workforce. It's now 19% and it's projected to be 22%. A lot of that is due to women, who by 2050 could make up as many workers aged 55 plus as men. So the workforce will be getting older and more female. But in future, the workforce is going to be, is projected to age slower than the population. So you can see the share of people 55 plus in the total population. Those two lines converged, and then in the next 2 decades, they're diverging slightly. And that's for 3 reasons. 1, baby boomers are retiring over the next 2 decades. 2, there's increases in the oldest old within the population. And 3, there's that slowdown that we've just been talking about in participation rate increases at older ages. So all this is happening while, of course, remember that older people remain potentially exposed to market shocks. So the projections tend to abstract from short-term changes, and yet you still get shocks such as the pandemic that we've seen. So not only do older people don't necessarily lose their jobs as readily as younger people, but they take longer to find work. On early numbers, and I'm not showing you a chart on purpose, but there's loads of charts in the brief. I don't want to bamboozle you too much. But on early numbers, we are seeing there's more older women in unemployment, for example. Again, low labour demand could mean that more of them retire. But there's also long-term structural changes that can also raise the risk of leaving older cohorts behind. And I demonstrate that in 3 charts here. So there's long-term structural change into job types which are intensive in non-routine work. Most of that is driven by younger cohorts, whereas if you look at changes in older cohorts, there's not as much change. So it really reminds us that older cohorts do need the support policies such as lifelong learning to make sure that they adapt to changes within the macro labour market. So that's some of the macro. Now we move to sort of high-level barriers and what have the trends been here. So ageing, I always remind myself, is clearly a good news story. Health has improved tremendously to the point that older people aged 55 to 64 really could be considered prime age is one argument. So this is shown in this chart looking at percentage of people in good or excellent health. As you can see, that decline is shallowing quite a lot over the last 30 years. So, for example, those in their 60s, I should also note that this chart is cut off at 50%, so you don't decline to 0 down here. For example, those in their 60s say that nearly 80% say their health is good or excellent, which is equivalent to people in their 40s 30 years ago. This is the old chestnut, 60 is the new 40, or should I say the middle-aged chestnut. I couldn't help it. Disability risk is also down 10% for people aged 55 to 64. But of course, there are people with chronic illnesses and disability within the labour market, and we know from work by CEPAR researchers that there is quite a lot of discrimination in disability in Australia, and we know that Australia's worse at employing people with disabilities than a lot of other OECD countries. Health affects ability to work, but work may also be protective of health. So this is an example of work by CEPAR's Karen Anstey and Ross Andel, showing that cognitive capacity declines more for those who retire, having controlled for pre-existing conditions and various things like that. It also declines more for people retiring from higher status jobs. Sometimes it's not own health, but the health of those around you that may be challenging. For example, caring for adults increases with age. And you can see that in charts here, women on the left and men on the right. And the lines are higher for people aged 55 to 64. But the trend suggests that overall the incidence of caring for adults has declined. Fewer people say that they are other non-primary carers, but more people are saying that they're primary carers. So essentially what you're getting is what seems to be a specialization in care, that a smaller group is doing more of that caring. It possibly means also polarization within the labour market, which could be concerning. So we look at that here. So this is employment status by carer status. And the positive story here is that the lines are moving in parallel. So the increases, especially for women, for carers, is increasing at a similar rate as non-carers, but the gap is still very large. Not only are older people healthier, but each new cohort of older people is more educated. So if you look at percentages of people with a bachelor or above, 20 years ago, people reaching 55 to 64 had 13% of them with that level of education. 10 years ago, 20%, now 25%, a quarter, and it's about to be a third, especially if you add women whose educational attainment is particularly high. That's formal learning, which in the society we've created declines with age. It's mainly at the start of life. But once you're within the work environment, there's work-related training. The thing to notice there is that it does decline after middle age. Also on this ABS data, it has declined over time, which is concerning. You put all these together and essentially the question might be, are we preparing older people with lifelong learning enough to be ready for continued work? And this also bears out in research on the ground. So for example, work by Daniela and others found that 40% of 55 to 64-year-olds thought their organisation provided little or no training regardless of age. Final barrier here is social attitudes. So with ageism, you get this distortion between that labour being supplied and labour being demanded by perhaps misinformation that employers might have. So we wanted to look at whether there's been trends. Most of the data is point estimates. So for example, here's some work by Kate O'Loughlin within CEPAR. It showed that when asked about older versus younger workers, loads of people said that older people were more likely to get fired, less promoted, less adaptable, difficult to teach new things, stereotypical things about older people. So are things changing? Well, the Australian Human Rights Commission, Kay may talk about this later, has some data series. So this is HR respondents that assessed characteristics of older and younger people. And it's encouraging to see that the people saying that no difference between young and old across these various categories is increasing. We also looked at HILDA data, which goes from 2008 to 2018. The rate of ageism experience of ageism within the workplace is much lower than some of these numbers. So they're sort of below 10%, but they're increasing for older people and decreasing for younger people. And finally, how do those age-related barriers play out in the labour market across various indicators? Here we compare Australians' labour market experience against older people in other countries, and we look at what's happening in job security and also in terms of involuntary retirement trends. I'm giving you a short respite from the charts, and I'll just tell you what 20 charts looking at the various indicators in the brief compare. Essentially, Australia appears in the middle of the pack in most indicators. So things like employment, unemployment duration, even though very high for older people, is actually very high for older people in all OECD countries. Earnings disparity between young and old. Australia scores less well on old age gender gaps, although the data is older. There's been some catch up. Still, we know from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency that the gap increases with age. And finally, while education and health amongst older Australians is among the highest in the OECD, their levels of training are worse. Although, again, some of the OECD reports don't necessarily agree on that strictly. We looked at trends in job security as well within by age and sex. Overall, the findings suggest that part-time, voluntary and involuntary, and casual work remain a very big feature of the Australian labour market, as shown in this chart for casuals as a share of employees. Women are more likely to be engaged in insecure work, things like involuntary part-time, temping, multiple jobs, although at a very low level, and increases in incidence of insecure work is worth saying that is potentially overstated. So a lot of them are either down or stable. Some increases in terms of involuntary part-time and multiple jobs, but again, multiple jobs is at a sort of about 5-6% level. Having said that, a fifth of older employees on casual contracts is not trivial, and we know from some research that about half of them don't have guaranteed hours, and we've seen some of the issues that have come up with COVID. We also know from some CEPAR research that chronic insecure work can have negative psychological effects and is related to involuntary retirement, which is my final point here. Here's where you see some of those barriers coming together. The main driver of declines in involuntary retirement is health improvements that I've talked about. That's in the dark teal on the left and dark red for women on the right. But as health improves, the other increasingly important driver of involuntary retirement is job-related involuntary retirement. And that's the sort of stuff where perhaps someone's pushed out of the labour force because their job finishes, they get retrenched. And that's in grey in these charts. Again, that relates to the employer's side, the labour demand side of things. And that is my presentation. So in brief, a large talent pool of older workers, still some barriers, but a lot of improvements, and middle of the pack on comparisons, but some groups find it more difficult. So essentially, a lot of the solutions come from employer and government strategies, which is some of the things that Marian's talking about next.
Next speaker is Professor Marian Baird.
Morning, everyone, and I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, to say that I am a visitor from Gadigal country, which is where Sydney University is. And it's just a delight to be in Canberra again, and thank you very much for hosting our CEPAR policy dialogue here at the Crawford Institute. Thank you, Professor Bell, it was a wonderful introduction. And thank you, Warwick, for all the work you do. And I know Rosanna and Silke have done a huge amount of work in the background to enable us to get to this point today. So I'm going to pick up exactly where Raf left off, which is wonderful planning. I'm going to look at government policies and employer policies and bring you, I hope, some of our most recent research on what is it that is happening in our workplaces in Australia. And that is the focus of our stream, the Mature Workers in Organisation stream of CEPAR. The work I'm bringing to you is really a combined effort, of course. So I really want to acknowledge my research associate, Alison Williams, who's here, my two wonderful PhD students, CEPAR students, Daniel Denali and Lisa Gulasarian. And I'm sure Daniel and Lisa will have contributions to make because their theses are actually right in the field that Raf has been talking about. And my colleague, Associate Professor Myra Hamilton, who isn't well and had to stay in Sydney, she'll be joining us online. And of course, Vanessa Lowe, Dr. Vanessa Lowe, who's also one of our CEPAR colleagues. So it's wonderful to have, that's the Sydney team, and I'll let Sharon introduce her Perth team later. Okay, so what are we going to look at here? Well, this is a policy framework that we have been working with. It's a very simple diagram, but I think it might help explain the way in which policies interact in Australia and impact on Australian employers and what they should or are not doing. And in this framework, we begin at the base with the legislative and public policy policies, and these are mandated and statutory. So these are policies that employers have to comply with. We then look at those policies that are introduced as a result of collective bargaining with unions, and those policies also are mandatory. They should be complied with within Australian workplaces. We then move up into organisational policies, and these are policies that companies themselves introduce. They're usually unilaterally decided, and of course companies have the ultimate discretion around those. And the final group are those that we know operate extensively through Australian workplaces. They are those policies that come under managerial discretion, often referred to as informal arrangements. Now that interaction, of course, we don't really terribly well understand in Australia, and we're working on that in our work on mature workers, but I think it's a framework that's useful for understanding the way in which policy interacts in Australia in all workplaces across all domains. I do want to pick up, and I won't spend time on it because Raf has done an excellent point, but my interest, as you've heard from my bio, is that I am very interested in gender and work, and I've been tracking the changes in the Australian labour market over the last 20 years in my research. And I think what's very interesting, my early days were around parental leave and why this, what we used to call the nappy valley, that period where women exited the labour market to have children and often didn't return or return in much smaller numbers. This enormous shift that's happened with Australian women's participation. So the dark red line is 66, and this is 2019. And we have spent a lot of time, understandably, looking at Australian working mothers and how they interact with the labour market and what policies can enable them to combine their work and family responsibilities. But actually, the biggest increase has been mature females. And that actually raises a whole set of other queries and questions and really problems for how do these older women who are also being faced with elder care responsibilities and grandparenting responsibilities operating in our labour market. And so as I have grown older along this track, I am now interested in what happens to those mature women. And what sort of policies do we have in Australia? Well, we do have a number of policies, but before I get on to those policies, I want to mention that we are in a situation where government is trying to encourage, to prolong, to increase participation rates. And I do want us to come back at the end of the day, I hope, to that very interesting question that Raf raised. Should we be aiming higher with participation rates, for participation rates in Australia, for both men and women? And if we do, what's the policy context that we could achieve that in? And I do think that's one of the questions we have to very carefully consider. And our research, as I've said, is looking at how those public policies interact with organisational policies. just at a very brief overview, we have quite an extensive regime of legislation in Australia. The Anti-Discrimination and Fair Work Act at the federal level provide a number of protections for older workers. And then when we get to the state level, work health and safety laws, which of course are being harmonised across the states, plus our workers' compensation or return to work laws, are also aimed at, in many respects, older workers. So it's not that we don't have a strong policy basis for encouraging and enabling older workers to return or stay in the workplace and to, in some instances, be able to combine their out-of-work activities with work. So this is a slightly more elaborate description of that model, and this is how we have applied this model when we have done our policy reviews of the companies we are examining in our research. So the research program we're undertaking at CEPAR is a multi-pronged approach. And the early stage, of course, is the contact with organisations and encouraging them to participate with us, collaborate with us in this research. And those of you who've done social science research, that in itself requires a lot of investment in time and relationship building. But we have got a wonderful group of organisations involved in both our states, Western Australia and New South Wales. And in those organisations, we have been examining every policy that they have arising from all of these levels. The legislative minima that they have to comply with, their enterprise agreements, if they're applicable, their organisational policies and codes of conduct, and also those practices that their supervisors may be and team leaders may be embarking on. And we're going to report on some of those, but of course to understand that policy, that list or that framework, you then have to dig deeper into the various policy areas that organisations have that relate to or potentially relate to older workers. Now, in Raf's slides, most of his definitions around older workers, or what we're calling mature workers in Australia, is 55 and above. But there is a body of work, and the ABS definition is 45 and above. So this is a very significant group within our Australian workplaces. These policies are ones that we would traditionally look at in through a human resource or industrial relations lens, if you like. Flexibility, training and learning, job design and redesign, recognition and inclusion, equality and fairness, health and well-being, retirement and redeployment. And so and then you can see within those big themes a whole host of other more specific policy areas. So in our policy reviews, we very carefully work through all the policies. And you can imagine in some organisations, if you bring together the legislative requirements of their state and federal, all their organisational documents around these policy areas, their enterprise agreements, and there may be a number of those, we end up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And Alison has become the expert at reading and interpreting all those policies. So we're going to look at those policies now. What has been happening in Australian workplaces? The first group I'm calling Case Study Group 1, and these are in local government organisations, 5 councils. And councils or local council areas and governments are very interesting organisations to study because they employ a lot of people. They employ males and females. They employ people of a wide range of ages. They employ wages and salaried workers, and they employ people who work indoors and outdoors. They employ people who do administration and care. They employ people who do maintenance and building. So it's a really good subsection or slice, if you like, of the Australian workforce. And interesting to see what's happening in these organisations. So here's a big graph. But on this, what we've done here is taken the 5 councils, and examined whether or not they have a statutory only policy, statutory and organisational, a formal organisational policy only, a collective bargaining policy only, or combined with other policies. You can go through the whole list. And what we see is that for most organisations, for most of the local councils we've been examining, 4 out of the 5, they rely on statutory and organisational policies across those themed areas I talked about. And then as you move down, you'll see that they start to include collectively bargained policies, some areas that policy is not addressed at all, and as we get to the end, there are some none of the councils have policies that don't cover any of those areas that we're talking about. So you can see the way in which the statutory and organisational policies become very important at the local council level. What areas do they focus on? Now, I think this is really a nice insight into what is going on. And here we see that 5 of the councils have a lot of formal organisational policy around health and well-being. Now, we speculate, and I think quite confidently, that this is because they really are looking at that work health and safety legislation requirements in their states. And of course, because they cover such a wide range of workers, they are really minimising their risk. Risk management becomes quite an important aspect of organisational policy. But what you can also see is that the areas that don't attract the attention that we would expect are flexibility, which is quite interesting. So Council 1 has 2 policies on that. So as you see, lower rates about this red one, flexibility, and also retirement and redeployment. So 2 areas that we know older or mature workers are both interested in and need to manage their working lives are not as well addressed through the policies of those local councils. And for myself, coming from an industrial relations background, I am actually interested in what role do unions play in this area? And here we see that, in fact, unions are not playing a significant role in the policy framework of local councils, despite the fact that these councils are all unionised. They have union representation. So a lot of policies have no input through collective negotiation, which we suggest later is an area that unions may want to address, given that they themselves are representing an older population and a more feminised population. And only 2 councils have a specific mature workers policy, Council 3 and Council 4, and 4 of the councils have a diversity policy, where you often find reference to older workers in our diversity policies. So we're getting quite an insight through this policy review of where the gaps in policies are at the organisational level. This is sort of a slide that gets inserted because I just thought it was a very interesting one. I've been doing a lot of work around what were worker preferences during COVID in terms of flexibility and working from home. This particular slide comes from our CEPAR Mature Workers in Organisations survey. And one of the things I think is important to note here is that, as we found through our employer interviews during COVID, older workers adapted actually very well through the COVID period, and the employers that we interviewed, and our report is available on our website, said that they were less concerned. Initially, they started off being concerned about their older workers, how they managed the transition in the lockdown to working from home and the technology. That turned out not to be the major problem. In fact, it was younger workers in isolation and difficult working conditions that was more problematic and of a great concern for employers. But the interesting point here is that 44% of older workers do not want to work from home in the future. Now, that may sound like a high number, or it may surprise you, or it may not, but that figure actually aligns exactly with other data we have from other surveys across the population, that there are at least 40% to 42%, so we're right in the middle with this, of workers who do not want to continue working from home. So when organisations think about flexibility policies, they can't assume that everyone wants to move home to work. So the second tranche of case studies we're doing are in state government departments. Now, these are interesting workplaces as well because they're enormous. They cover thousands of workers. We've got up to 30,000 employees in our case studies. That's a lot of material and data to manage. But the public sector in Australia is an older workforce. And when you look at age and industry structure, you see quite clear patterns. So looking at our public sector is important if we want to understand how our older workers are coping and managing and what are the employer responses. So again, we have done a policy review. We do a lot of stakeholder interviews in the early stages, then we do mature worker interviews and a large survey. And in this, I'm going to not concentrate on the statistical data, but on what the employees themselves are saying. And here we see that when we talk to older workers, they do have quite strong desires, aspirations and plans for the future. And our mature workers speak often of wanting to participate in training and career development opportunities. They do want flexible work arrangements, even though they may not want to work from home, and they do need adequate leave arrangements. They do express a desire for part-time work, and almost all interviewees stated they were unaware of any support that their employer provides to assist mature workers with retirement planning, which comes as a bit of a surprise considering we've been talking about retirement planning for decades. The other issue I do want to pick up on in all of these areas, when we look at policy, we're very conscious of a point that was made earlier this morning, that policies usually apply to permanent ongoing workers in an organisation, and casual or contingent workers or labour hire workers do not have the access to the same paid leave or policies or opportunities for flexible work in the same way. And that is a big schism in our organisations. Gender and care comes up. Now, this goes back to my comment earlier that when we look at the overall patterning of the Australian labour market, mature women are in the labour market in much greater numbers than they have ever been. Australia has not had to face this situation before, and most of our organisations are actually not well equipped to handle the need for these women and increasingly men to look after their grandparents, some children, ageing parents or other family members. So we're in quite a period, I think, of high demand here. In the public sector, of course, there tends to be more support for people leaving and coming back in, though it does impact their care responsibilities. And that's where we see a lot of this managerial discretion playing out. Who has the authority to provide people with leave, to give them the unofficial leave or the official leave? And is that applied on a consistent basis throughout the organisation? And finally, workplace cultures and practices. Most of our interviewees do comment that mature workers make important and positive contributions to the workplace, that there is a value of working in age-diverse teams. However, they are unaware of specific policies or practices designed for mature workers. They're not sure that they are fully included and accepted. So there is a sense that, yes, they are positive members of the organisational community, but their talents, their abilities are not always tapped into, and they're not always given the opportunities that they would like. And of course, this is a very common statement. My biggest fear is that there will be some kind of organisational restructure and I'll lose my job before I retire. So organisational restructures and redundancies, whether it's explicit or implicit, target older workers. And this is something, of course, we have seen in the university sector far and wide. And there are reasons for it at times. Sometimes it's a bonus for people, but on the whole, it is also something that they face with some fear. So out of all that, we're coming up with ideas and recommendations for organisations. And when we provide our policy reports to those organisations that we're working with, we're very careful to provide what could be useful for them. As researchers, we're not just there to take their information, but to interact with them and give them some ideas as well. And they've given us plenty of ideas too. So we highlight and sort of give them commendations for the excellent policies they do have. And we also note those areas where we think they could be strengthened. So one of the areas is considering a mature workers policy. Most organisations don't have anything around mature workers. I think it's something we might come back to in discussion later in the day. I'll signal that for later, because some workers also say we don't want to be targeted as a separate group. So finding a way through this that allows organisations to acknowledge and recognise the special needs of older workers without putting a brand on those workers and then targeting them for the less advantageous parts of organisational life. We should focus on the strengths of mature workers and how to leverage that in organisations. Actively encourage job sharing. This is starting to come through. It's also one of the elements that COVID highlighted, that job sharing is now back on the agenda when we talk about flexible work options, especially around maybe older worker, younger worker pairing to enable corporate knowledge to be provided, but also that nice training that younger workers can provide to older workers, potentially around the use of technology, for example. Refresher training on recruitment best practices and equity principles. There's a lot of attention in organisations on equity in recruitment, but not so much around age. And this is an area we think really does need attention. Really consider age when aiming for diversity in the composition of recruitment panels. Many organisations are starting to look at this, elder care and grandparent leave policies, and that's another idea that we are suggesting they consider. Transition to retirement policies, formal mentoring programs, etc., for junior colleagues, being mentored by older employees, and job design to accommodate the needs of mature workers. Now, they are the sort of big policy suggestions, and I know that Sharon and the Perth team will then, in the second half of the day, focus more closely on those job design areas. In summary, we'd say in Australia we do have quite an expansive legislative platform that has potential to positively impact on mature worker employment. But in many cases, this platform is actually not well known. For example, the right to request for over 55s, the right to request flexible working patterns. One of the problems we have is that there is no data collected on that in a systematic way. And that's a problem we have in Australia, data collection. And there's the opportunity for governments to really target their information delivery and their policies, I think, more closely and more loudly. There's scope for more attention by employers on their mature workers' needs, and this is going to become more and more relevant as we see an ageing workforce that Raf has outlined. There's a lot of opportunities for unions to give voice to mature worker needs as well. Mature workers are interested in flexibility, they are interested in training, and they are interested in the supports that can be provided to enable them to care for our older population. So we do have this clash occurring at the moment. And we think there's opportunity to really examine in more detail that interface between employment policies and welfare policies, and how those welfare policies, and my colleague Myra Hamilton will pick this up this afternoon as well, what that interface and how some welfare policies may be having a negative impact on employee participation opportunities. So finally, looking ahead with COVID, COVID forced employers to implement workplace flexibility. It forced employers to do things that they had been talking about for many years but hadn't implemented. And it happened very quickly, and in many cases quite successfully. So we think that COVID enables us now to look at existing policies more closely and tailor them to meet employee needs, remembering that some employees actually want to return to the workplace, to develop new workplace practices and cultures, having seen through COVID that there are groups who react in quite different way to these external shocks, and that we need to develop new policies to meet the changing needs for flexibility and support associated with health and care responsibilities. So thank you very much, and thank you, I meant to say at the beginning, to all our Zoom participants as well. I hope that came through nice and clearly. Thank you.
Thanks, Marian, for a wonderful presentation and for keeping right on time. I'll ask Mark to come to do the final presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Warwick, for the welcome, and thanks to CEPAR for the invitation to come along here today. And I just want to really commend Raf and Fatima for this is an excellent piece of work. It really brings together in 50 pages. It covers an astonishing range and depth of material. So well done. I was reflecting on when I was asked to come along and speak today. One of my kind of prior work experiences, I joined an outfit called the National Centre for Vocational Education Research. If you're in the kind of skills area, it's a pretty well-known outfit. I joined it in 2003 and took charge of its statistical operations. And one of the things it does is it publishes statistics on the number of students who participate in TAFE, what their kind of attributes are, the number of people who are doing apprenticeships, and what happens to the employment prospects of people who finish courses in TAFE and finish apprenticeships and so on. And so I'm looking through the first lot of publications that were due to publish, and one of the things, looking at the TAFE students, it has an age breakdown, and it went, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 39, 40 plus. And I thought, I've just turned 40. There's no way. There is no way I'm in the oldest age group. I've got to fix that. So we put a kind of more conventional kind of age band structure around that. But I mean, maybe that did say something at the time about the kind of thinking around what education and training was aimed for, and kind of like maybe how little attention was really being paid to lifelong learning. And I think I'll go on to make a couple of remarks, but I think one of the things we probably should focus a bit more on is that while there's unquestionably a lot of policy attention, both amongst governments and businesses, that could be paid to mature age workers' participation, it's a good news story compared to where it has been. So if this had been held 1 month later, I would have been able to show you a whole bunch of charts from the intergenerational report. But I can't.
Go on.
So it's a 5th intergeneration report, and it will be released by the Treasurer as per the Charter of Budget Honesty sometime before the end of this month. What I can do is maybe share a little bit of what the kind of Treasury thinking is that's gone into this year's report, and in the context of particularly this policy dialogue. And so I'll talk about it within that kind of, for those who are familiar with it, the intergeneration report uses what's become popularised and known as the 3 Ps framework. So you look at the contributions that population, participation and productivity make to living standards. And so in each successive one, we look out to imagine what the trajectory of population and participation and productivity will be, and therefore what that means for both the size of the economy, future living standards, but its actual fundamental purpose isn't the economic projections, it's to try to work out what the government's fiscal position will be, taking into account all the costs associated with things like ageing, such as health and retirement incomes. So if I look at population first, and I know that CEPAR works very closely with the Treasury's Centre of Population and has done some really interesting work with that centre, for example, on fertility rates and projecting those. And there is some interesting material coming in the IGR around fertility rates. Raf showed, and I think it's important that not only that I want to talk about the impact of COVID here, less about COVID and what it might have on fertility rates, but particularly the impact that COVID has had on migration and what that means for the future population. So Warwick mentioned that I spent a number of years in the Immigration Department as its chief economist, and I'm kind of familiar with the kind of time series of Australia's population flows going right back into the 19th century, and particularly since 1945. I could never have imagined the circumstances under which Australia would have negative population outflow due to migration. The last time that happened was in World War II. So maybe you could think a war might happen, but I'd never contemplated a pandemic. Treasury has done work on pandemics, but I don't know that it explored the impact of pandemics on population movements, and it really is staggering to see that Australia's had a net outflow of more immigrants leaving than immigrants arriving over the course of 2021, expected to continue in 2022 and become net positive again in 2023. This chart's from the budget papers. And then we see the rate of population growth kind of getting back up towards what it had been prior to COVID, but a bit lower. And I think all of that's kind of consistent with what the charts that Raf had up before. But the other point to make is this, thinking about participation of the life cycle, is this shadow effect, which will happen because of this smaller population growth than what there otherwise would have been, and missing out on a very large chunk of people who are aged, who are young adults, who would continue to work over a long period of time. This does have a weighing effect on future participation rate because of that. So let me now turn more specifically to participation, and as I already mentioned, the increasing participation of women and of older workers, both men and women, has been really one of the most remarkable features of the Australian labour market over the last number of decades, and it's happened in many other countries as well. I'm going to skip over this. So this is a chart. This is the male chart, and I'll show the female one in just a minute, where we look at the participation rates across age cohorts. And so Treasury has finally moved to using a cohort-based approach to estimating future participation rates. And if you go back and look at the 4 previous IGRs, you'll easily observe that Treasury's fallen kind of well short of the mark in underestimating the increase in participation in the future. We think that this cohort-based approach, which I think probably people have been recommending for a number of years, is the right one to adopt, and we think we'll do a better job in this coming IGR in projecting the future, but that's obviously remains to be seen, because it's the whole thing is premised under a no policy change scenario. So I haven't put the legend down here because it takes up too much space, but roughly the way to think about this is the older cohorts are those that are in the red, and the younger cohorts, the youngest cohorts are the ones that are in the green, the blue, and the green are the middle-aged ones. And so you can see that there's been a drop in participation rate of full-time men at the younger stages, 15 to 19, you see those green lines dropping, shading down into the blue, and then we've got about 20% of 15 to 19-year-old men working full-time. And then at the other end of the age distribution, you see this, it's more clustered, but just the falling away of participation at the old age rates, and an increase in participation of part-time men in the latter, in the older age of the distribution. And for women, again, a familiar story, but more, the changes have been much more pronounced. Again, a drop in full-time participation for younger women, and a big increase in full-time participation for women, which you observe from about the mid-30s, early 40s, with successive cohorts. And so what we've done so we published a Treasury working paper in April, I think. One of the people in my division, Linus Gustafsson, has done a terrific work and taken these cohorts and then uses the changes in successive cohorts to then project what might happen into the future. And as per Raf made the point, what's in the IGR will end up coming out pretty similar to where he shows it, because he's used our model, I think, to try to do that work. So it shows that the rate of increase in participation has been moderating, and the expected gains in coming decades are relatively modest. I think one way of thinking about this, which is nicely touched on in the paper, is just to imagine that what's happened, in a sense, is that the period in which people engage with the labour market has kind of shifted to the right of the age distribution. So people are marrying later, they're having children later, they're buying houses later, they're entering full-time work later, and they're working longer. And so there's a kind of question here about whether there is is there an upper bound? So Sharon's, 70, hasn't retired yet, had a couple of goes at retiring, but, do we imagine that we're going to be in a world where there's going to be many people working beyond the age of 70? So it'd be interesting to maybe have some discussion about that. So the net effect of what we've done with our projections is that while we do expect that there will be slightly higher propensities to participate amongst older age groups, that nonetheless the volume of people moving into older age groups which have a lower propensity to participate than younger people, the net effect of that will drag down the aggregate participation rate by a bit. So you can see here what we've done is we've fitted the model to the actual data, and of course, as models do, they have a good fit to the past. Hopefully, they have a good fit to the future. But if this is the way that things go forward, we do expect the aggregate participation rate to ease off a bit. Now, it's important to make the point, made it already, that one way. I think it's really important to make this point. So the intergeneration report is not an attempt to say this is what the future will be. It's a thought experiment. What we're saying is this is what, if nothing else happened, based on, we didn't change policy, and based on what we know is what's going on in the world, this is what the future could look like. But of course, the purpose of it is to give government the information to change policy settings, to try to change the future to one which they think might be more preferable. Some people get a bit hung up about the projections in the intergeneration report and say this is what it's going to look like, but that's of course not what it's going to look like. And one of the nice things that will feature in this year's intergeneration report is some comparisons around what's happened over successive projections and why things have changed over time. It seems to me inevitable, given the growth in the volume of older persons in the population, and the kind of political economy around that there is going to be kind of tremendous debate and pressure around retirement income policies, for example, and these broader questions around what policy, legal levers governments might pull, and also how employers might respond to that. And also, I think maybe a bit understated in the paper is thinking through what preferences are, and there's a little bit of that in Marian's presentation around preferences. So let me just say a few things about this notion of trying to aim for a participation rate equal to the level of New Zealand or Sweden. So the first question is, I'd be wanting to get an answer to the question is how significant is the pool of untapped labour among older persons? So there's that question about, is there an upper bound? Now, if you look at the data, and I don't pay a huge amount of heed to these kind of data, but it's still interesting. If you look at the data on discouraged job seekers and people who are marginally attached to the labour force, you don't find that there's anything striking about older persons in terms of their responses to the ABS surveys on this. So in fact, the incidence of people who are, or the rate of people who are discouraged job seekers amongst 55 to 64-year-olds is no different to that in lower age groups. And if you broaden it out to the marginally attached, it's actually lower than it is for younger age groups. And when you go to people who are age 65 or more, it's really quite modest. People who are in that age group who are saying that they're marginally attached. Now, something's going on there, and I would say that the economic circumstances for older persons, many older people, are sufficient that they are able to realise their preferences not to work because they have a retirement income stream and they don't need to work to pay off their mortgages or whatever. And so there's some issues around that. The second point I'd make, at least for the purposes of projecting future economic activity and living standards, is that we don't really care per se about participation. What we care about is labour utilisation. So it's true that Sweden has a higher labour force participation rate than Australia, but it has lower labour utilisation in terms of hours worked per person. And that's something I think that's worth bearing in mind. And the third thing I'd say is we need to be mindful of possible trade-offs. And if I was going to look across to New Zealand, yes, it's true that they have higher participation rates, but I think there's an argument you could make that New Zealand's higher participation rates are a contributory factor to their significantly lower level of productivity. And as a result, people probably are aware that New Zealand has significantly lower living standards than Australia, and it's at a trade-off that we're willing to countenance. So that leads me to our final slide, and I'm just about to finish, Warwick. Around productivity, I do think, if I'm looking at this kind of suite of challenges that Australia faces, I think productivity is a bigger challenge than participation. I know that's a bit outside the scope of this policy dialogue, but I just wanted to kind of make you aware of it and how we're thinking about it for the intergeneration report. Each of the 4 successive reports have taken the convention that it's really difficult, if not impossible, to model productivity compared to trying to model or project participation or population. And so the approach that's been taken is to take the average of the past 30 years. The average of the past 30 years in Australia is 1.5% per year in GDP per hour worked. And you'll see that's the red line running across the whole spectrum of the chart. And you can see that if you were to go back to the early 2000s, we've only hit that average in 4 years out of roughly the last 20. This is a really big challenge for Australia if we kind of care about future living standards. I think it's a positive story about older workers. It looks to me like there's going to be a pivot point around the technological change becoming positive age biased. If I look at one of those charts that Raf put up, the 1965 to 74 cohort has a high share of people working in non-routine cognitive jobs, and those people are currently aged 47 to 56. That's the cohort that's coming through. So I think there's a reason to feel positive about that. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Catherine. It's not working. Can I please ask the panel to come to the front? Is that working? Yep. We have eaten into the Q&A time, and we do have a constraint because after the coffee break, we have a speaker beaming in from overseas, and they're already up late.
Yes.
So please have a seat. If you have a question, will you please raise your hand, and I will relay the question to the panel. Yeah, okay. Yes, John.
I guess this question is directed at Mark Cully, but everyone. To what extent, I mean, we've seen from what Marian said and also from what Rafal said, that there are interrelationships between caring and the way in which retirement income is provided to older cohorts and work decisions, labour participation decisions. So my question primarily to Mark is, to what extent are economic policies covering those three broad portfolios, employment, retirement, aged care, to what extent is there a concern with coordination between those policies?
Okay, so John's question was looking at the three areas, employment, aged care, and retirement, and does there need to be coordination between those three areas?
I think I'm just going to answer that and say yes.
To what extent is it happening?
To what extent is it happening?
Well, not as much as it should, which is implicit in the answer yes. So I'm not an expert in retirement incomes or anything like that, but and I'm not across in ways that you might be, the retirement income review that was published recently by Treasury and the extent to which it engaged in those issues about those interconnections with ageing and decisions. I imagine it focused quite a bit on the decision to engage in the labour market, but whether it intersects with caring responsibilities, I'm not sure. But it's a good question.
So I have a question.
Agenda.
Sorry, would anyone else like to address that?
I think it's probably worth saying that in our submission to the Aged Care Royal Commission, we said that you need to take a holistic view of these things, and the fact that if you provide good formal aged care, it may relieve some of the pressures for women to be able to work. So I think it's something that's sort of out there, but I don't know how much it's being taken account in the whole.
Marian, did you?
No, I won't.
Okay. I have a question online from Anonymous. Do we know what characteristics are evident in mature age workers or employers who employ them?
What characteristics?
So could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, do we know what characteristics are evident in mature age workers or employers who employ them?
Oh, is there certain types of employers that employ older workers more than others?
Yeah, I think that might be the focus of the question.
There's some really cool charts that I've got in the brief on that, looking by industry and occupation. The fact that, for example, women are older women are overrepresented in healthcare professions. Older men are overrepresented in transport and logistics, which I found sort of surprising. The other thing that Marian also mentioned was in public sector. So public sector tends to overemploy, so to speak, compared to the average worker.
I'll add to that.
Yes, definitely.
Something we didn't actually specifically cover, but other research has shown that women, if I go back to what Raf was talking about, demand and supply in the labour market, two things have happened over the last 30 years. The industry restructures that have occurred in most OECD countries have meant that there are more jobs in what we call the service sectors, and typically care, education, hospitality, retail, etc. Those jobs, if I link this with other research, require a different type of worker, one who uses their emotional labour often, and that sort of work, whether or not it is gender stereotype, seems to attract women more than men. Now, there's a big debate about whether women are better at that sort of work or not, but it's certainly the case that we have seen an influx of women into those industries, as your data shows, Raf, and they are the growth industries as well. So we have this situation where the growth industries are the industries that women are working in.
I'll hold this. Your microphone's not working.
What's happening is that the industries that are in decline are the industries that traditionally men worked in. So there's sort of a legacy effect in those areas and a new effect in the emerging and growing industries. And that does link to what do employers want out of those workers.
Can I ask Raf and Marian to turn on their microphones?
I did, but it's not working.
Oh, okay, I can walk around with this.
Yeah.
I should say that previous question was actually from Mark DeCure, not anonymous. It's coming through in a rolling feed. Now, I do have a question at the back here.
Yeah, just one of the slides that Marian had, I think it was 44% of mature workers not wanting to go back with respect to working from home, continuing working from home. What do you think is driving that response? Is it, say, insecurity about their own position in the organisation, or is it, just traditional values, not wanting to telecommute? What do you think is driving that sort of response amongst mature workers?
So the question to Marian was the 44% of mature workers that did want to return to the workplace and not work at home. What do you think is driving that particular outcome?
That's right. Thanks. Thanks, Daniel. Well, the first point I'd make is it's not just mature workers who are reporting that they want to work from home. They don't want to continue working from home. So we get about the same proportion in all the surveys. About 2/5 of workers want to return to the workplace. We don't know because survey data picks up that preference. It doesn't tell us why. I'll speculate. One is social interaction. Two is presence in a workplace does make a difference if you think of job security and insecurity. And it could be that older workers, when we link that to what we know about fear of redundancy, is that if they're present, they're less likely to be targeted for redundancies and organisational restructures potentially. And I think, well, they're probably the two big ones, social interaction and security, as you mentioned, at work. It could just be an issue of the way in which we work too. I mean, people know that some jobs can only be done at work, not at home. But it's a good research question, and hopefully someone will fund some more research in that area.
Okay, we have a question over here.
I just wanted to pick up on the informal elder care issue which Marian addressed. Maybe this is a question perhaps for Mark, I don't know. Informal elder care is so important for the functioning of the actual aged care system, which has been so under scrutiny lately, both residential and in the community. And paid and unpaid leaves are so much needed to make the formal system work properly. But public policy seems such a long way from moving towards the idea of enhancing paid and unpaid leaves for informal elder carers and who are working. So I just wondered if you had any views on whether that might shift, where it might go, how things could shift.
So the question to Mark was that informal aged care is important for the functioning of the aged care system. Both paid and unpaid leave is a key aspect of that. And do you have any views, Mark, on where that's heading and what can be done?
I'm sorry, I don't. It's well outside my area of expertise.
Shall I?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not in government, but I do want to thank Alex for that question because it's a really critical question. And I think the pandemic has really also, to use that lovely expression Sharon used this morning, the crack in the system that's now been exposed because we don't have paid or unpaid leaves for a huge proportion of our workforce. That's exactly what's happening with elder care. And so what we don't know in our stats is that those women who are not appearing in our participation rates are just not there because they know they can't combine the elder care with work, and we don't even know if that's why really, we have a little bit of data on that you showed, if that's why they leave the labour market too. So it's a really critical area, and it is a policy, I think, policy area that government could lead on, which would be of great benefit to Australia, both in pandemics and in whatever normal circumstances we end up in. Thanks, Alex.
So I just found, just to follow up, I found it interesting that in our data we found this trend, this upward trend in employment rates for primary carers. I don't know what leads, what has changed over time that has allowed more people to combine care responsibility with work. But it seemed, and the gap is still very wide, but it was interesting just to see that there was this positive change.
I think we're going, time for one more question.
Sharon wanted to ask.
Well, Sharon, do you?
Hopefully a quick question. We keep hearing about the increase in older women workers that constantly increases. Is that the main contributor to that, the lack of superannuation for women in this sort of plus 50 age group compared to men who it seems have got enough money to retire?
So the question was the increase we see in older women working, is that being driven by the need to build super balances relative to the requirements for older men?
I mean, I think it could be part of the incentive structure. You know, the retirement income system is an incentive. By having superannuation means that if you can work, you contribute, then you have more for retirement. But the evidence that we see from various sources is that it was a lot to do with the buoyant labour market that allowed women to re-enter in midlife and then continue within the labour market. Whether there was these micro incentives that played a part as well, it could be.
I'd like to add a little bit to that because we do have a paper coming out, which we hope shortly, which Vanessa's leading on. If I get this right, contrary to previous sort of assumptions, what we see amongst older people, including older women, is that financial incentives are the biggest driver to stay and continue working. That can be the major driver, or in a second category, it's finance plus the other social benefits. So I do think finance is driving older women and potentially men. And we saw that after the last recession too, the big bit of a lift in older men's working because of superannuation largely.
I suspect...
Mark, would you have the last word?
Yeah, I suspect that one particular subgroup of the people you're talking about are particularly older single women who, you know, we know they have very low superannuation balances and they don't have the circumstances under which they can readily retire as part of a bigger household.
Well, thank you very much. I have to draw this session to a close because we are breaking for coffee and we would really like you back here at 11 o'clock sharp. Please join me in thanking the three panellists and also